Step 3, adding new fields. So presumably we set up our content model and it worked for us for a while, but now, hey, just like we were talking about, things have changed and we need to add new fields into our content to describe new things. Maybe we're adding in personalization, who knows? But the concept of content model evolving is something that should be top of mind. It should be part of your mindset. The architecture should take into account the fact that it will change and evolve.
One thing that I like to push people when they're doing their content architecture to think about around this one is ways to group your fields. So for example, we have the idea of kind of sub tabs or subgroups within your content model to allow you to kind of group things together so it's clearer and easier to find things. You may have a tab that just has 1 or 2 fields on it. It might seem like, oh, that's, or a section that might have 1 or 2 fields. That might seem like overkill. But if you add more fields to that down the road, so visualize, where maybe will we add more fields or maybe expand. That personalization is a great example. Today, maybe there's one categorization or one tagging kind of cluster, but down the road, maybe you have personas and you have regions and you have all sorts of other properties that would be there. So maybe you want to add a tab or a section called personalization or segmentation, and then you have this area to add other fields. And as you evolve and add new fields, you don't get this messy, input form with a whole bunch of fields all over the place, and it's not clear where to go. If you're not editing those fields all the time, keep them a little off to the side and have them grouped. It really does help.
I can see us doing another webinar just on personalization and segmentation of content, John, where we can dig more deeply into that, because I think that's a really important thing. I've looked at a lot of content models where you just have a massive long list of fields, and it can be a little bit hairy scary for a new user to look at that and wonder what 100%. They all mean. This is a bit of an opinionated statement from me personally, John, where I say content ops is not DevOps. So DevOps is for developers for code that goes through a development workflow. As far as I'm concerned, content from a CMS, any content platform, that's not what it's for. We want to get outside of that DevOps pipeline so that we don't need a developer to be involved. Now, content can be involved in the DevOps pipeline, and it absolutely is in a lot of scenarios, but we want to be able to publish content without it being treated the same as code. It is similar to code in that it affects the output, but we're not developers as content editors. We want to be able to do things with a little more rhythm. So we have to take that into account when we're adding new fields into our content models. It means that the code that's using those fields needs to understand that the field wasn't there, now it's there, and what's the default value? Has all the content been updated with that new field? What's the impact?
One thing I'll just highlight too for everyone is just the content ops term, which is a newer term, I think, just to kind of clarify the difference between these things too. So DevOps is your development pipeline. So when you push content to staging, production, UAT, all these different environments, and content ops is more about the life cycle of your content. So you create your content, maybe you have some workflow back and forth internally with people, approval processes, things like that. You stage it, you preview it, you publish it. Obviously, when you publish and preview and do these things, it is going through the DevOps side as well, but you're looking at it from a content perspective in terms of verifying to make sure it is ready to go out, ready to be published, and it's kind of that workflow stage of creating content to publishing.
And just going hand in hand with that idea of adding a new field and what is the impact of that from a DevOps or code perspective, our developers need to assume that the values on new fields could be empty. So we don't necessarily, especially where so much content is kind of moved around into different places, and content could be synced, it could be pulled in from different APIs. It's just easy to assume that a new field doesn't have a value yet when you add it. And that way you can test code across any of your environments if you make that assumption and that you're flexible enough for that. And over time, that does get more complex in your code, where now all the fields that have been added since the version 1.0 of your, project, whatever solution it was, you're going to have a lot more kind of null checks. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Checking for null in code is something that developers have gotten better at over the years, at least.
I'll expand this a little bit too. That I think this is important to do even in version 1 of your content model and the fields you have. So you may build a beautiful content model and it has required fields, and the developers may say, oh, those fields are required, so I'm not going to null check on those. But this isn't related to adding new fields. It comes a little later, but deleting fields or or renaming fields or other or just maybe you change your model so you don't want this field to be required down the road. Your developers, and this is on this assuming value should be empty, could be empty is on the development side, but the developer should also be considering that a field that was required someday could become empty, and how does the system gracefully come back? So if you build a website and you have that pricing example that we had in a couple pages back with that little app, and it had that product with the pricing, what happens if there's no price this one day or something like that? How does the app handle that and gracefully back off? And that's really, really important going forward to handle kind of validation checks of what content is coming through on the development side.
Yeah, I like the idea of a graceful degradation. That takes me right back to Comp Sci 101 back in University of Guelph, which we both attended, John. We're just talking about, hey, all code should degrade gracefully when the circumstances around that code change. And really, content is an outside implicator to DevOps. It's one of those things where it's not part of the code. And as developers, we need to make sure that the DevOps takes that into account, which means we need to test it, then deploy it. If we think of, we have like maybe a development environment, UAT, staging, production environments, all of those environments need to have the ability to be tested and validated with our content, oftentimes with the same content. And that's one of the things where I've been, a huge sort of voice trying to push the idea of we have one content repository that can work across all those environments, so that we can test it, and it's just fewer variables. And that's just my opinion, but I think that it makes life a lot easier.
And Ella has a question here. So there can be fields sitting there that everyone ignores. Is that better than having to build them in? So great question. A lot of people build a content model and think about the output, like how is this going to be rendered? What fields do I need for this? Or really try to get your head a little higher level than that. What fields and content makes sense for that model? And then decide how you use it. Because, for example, you may have a whole bunch of hidden fields that don't show up on the website for certain types of content or fields that go to an app, and you just ignore them on one channel and not the other channel, or you ignore them completely, but they're part of that content. A great example was the comment I said previously about adding that high resolution image. That's a field that's not used if you can't auto render it through the CDN and optimize it. But it's a field that's part of your model that you can reuse later over and over again. And if you really think of a content-first approach of modeling the content for your business, you could have lots of full content models that never show up anywhere, actually. And it's just used for relationships, used for linking content, or just used for storing that information to be used at a later time.